Great. Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to see some people here today. We welcome some of you are fellows of Salzburg Global Seminar, and you've taken part in a range of our programs. Some of you are new. We know that we have a lot of people who have requested a recording of this and will be watching this recorded because that's what's been happening the last few in this webinar series. But for those of you who are live, thank you for joining us. And for those of you who are listening later, thank you also for joining us, and please be in touch. My name is Charles Ehrlich. I'm a program director at Salzburg Global Seminar. We wish we could greet you all personally in Salzburg, Austria. We will greet some of you there soon, but we're delighted that people can join us live and recorded virtually in this platform. For those of you who do not know Salzburg Global Seminar, we are an independent not-for-profit organization founded in 1947 to challenge current and future leaders to shape a better world. For 75 years, whether at our home of Schloss Leopoldskron, online, or in locations around the world, our retreat-like programs have provided a forum for global exchange and transformation. At our home in Schloss Leopoldskron, we are also currently providing free accommodation, meals, and other assistance to refugees from Ukraine, escaping the Russian invasion and the unprovoked war Russia is waging on their country. In our organization's early years, we were trying to pick up the pieces after the Second World War, and we also provided accommodation and safety for refugees and displaced persons seeking healing and recovery. Throughout the Cold War, our institution was one place where people from both sides of the Iron Curtain and from the Third World could gather and speak openly and candidly with their peers on common issues and concerns. After the Cold War, Salzburg Global Seminar was instrumental in working with partners in Russia and the former Soviet-dominated countries to build up university systems, civil society organizations, and other institutions interested in global dialogue and peace. Some of you may know that I personally, between 2009 and 2011, worked as an advisor for the presidential administration of the Russian Federation, so I'll just say that up front. The object then was to try to improve Russia's justice system for its citizens. I had previously worked in countries such as Georgia, which has also suffered Russian occupation, most recently invaded in 2008, and Russia continues to occupy 20% of its territory. In addition, I've lived and worked for 6 years in Kosovo, whose majority Albanian population had recently before suffered persecution and ethnic cleansing on a proportionally massive scale. During my legal career, I've also worked in a number of other formerly communist states, and although I identify myself as an Austrian citizen, I speak English with an American accent because I was born in the United States. My father arrived in the US in the summer of 1938 as a stateless child refugee using the passport of a country, Austria, that no longer existed. I've seen firsthand the consequences of the failure of the rule of law. Justice and the rule of law are tantamount to civilization and tantamount to our humanity. So given what's going on globally and what's going on within our individual countries, I think it's very important that we're gathered here today for this initiative. This is not one of our usual programs. It's an opportunity to introduce some of the work that our fellows have been engaged in on an important topic, and we invite people who are working on other subjects and the general public to become involved with these efforts as we continue to move forward. We originally conceived of and designed this initiative before the outbreak of COVID-19 in discussions we had with 3 US-based partners, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, and the David Rockefeller Fund. We thank all 3 of them for their support and encouragement as we have moved forward, particularly under the changed circumstances caused by the pandemic. What we saw was that in many countries, there's a growing recognition that effective criminal justice reform needs to look beyond the usual toolkit and institutions of the criminal justice system itself. We also recognize the pivotal contribution that global exchange could make to criminal justice reform efforts, including the seeding of new strategies in the United States and elsewhere. Because of the pandemic, we ended up doing all of our meetings online in 2021. We ultimately brought together 67 Salzburg Global Fellows from 19 countries into small interlocking working groups. We looked for points of intervention and big, potentially transformative ideas that could help shape the future of criminal justice systems. In addition to just mixing people from backgrounds which are traditionally involved with criminal justice, we also brought in fellows from education, health, business, media, and cultural spheres. The rich learnings from our workshops throughout 2021 are summarized in our report. And if you've not seen the report already, Antonia, my colleague, will put a link to it in the chat. I will also say, for those of you who are joining us not live, everything that will go in the chat, all the links and resources there, which you cannot see if you're watching a recording, will be put in a link that you can access these separately online after this goes live, this video goes live. The report is designed in a web-based format to be accessible, so dive right in. The report has developed summary key takeaways, examples, and recommended resources, and will continue to highlight these examples as we move forward. The next phase of the multi-year initiative includes this series of 5 public webinars. This is the 5th, in which we identify some of the most promising global examples of violence reduction and criminal justice transformation proven through research to be effective, viable, and replicable. Today, I will be speaking with Rait Kuuse, Khary Mason, and Marsha Levick. We will examine reforms that have put human dignity and empathy at their core and have in the process produced safer, healthier, and less violent communities for the next generation. I'd love to say everything's concluded and we're going to have the solution to everybody's justice problems. Unfortunately, that is not the case. And so Rait, Khary, and Marsha will all be able to speak to areas where there's still further work that can be done. How to ask a question. You can put it in the chat box for those of you who are live, of course. And we will draw upon those questions as we move forward after the original presentations. You can also put your comments in the chat box. If you'd like to share resources that you think are relevant, some of these can be then made available as well to the public with the video of this. And I've asked the 3 speakers to focus on innovations that they have been involved with that have achieved actual results, so not just a hypothetical, to serve as inspiration for others. So with that, I'd like to start with Rait. We will begin outside the United States because we have 2 speakers today from the US, and I think it is important to keep this global. Rait is from Estonia, and his bio will be going into the chat, so you can look up all the details there that I don't need to repeat now. But he's had some extensive experience also in the margins of the Soviet Union, so he's aware of many of the human interest issues that we're dealing with today. But he's also been involved in his own country of Estonia at a very high level for the last several years. And so I'll hand over to Rait to give an explanation of his experience in Estonia. Rait.
Thank you very much. Are you viewing my screen? Do you see it, Charles?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, very good. So hello to everyone. Very quickly to speak about some criminal justice reforming activities in Estonia. I'm honored. I have a quite long experience in the public sector since '99 when I was employed as a probation officer. But during this program, what Charles has introduced to us, I have changed my occupation again back to the criminal justice. So I don't know, was it because of it or influenced by it, but now I'm back in the Ministry of Justice and dealing with the penitentiary and probation issues, which I was dealing with 8 years ago before this year. Nevertheless, as this is global, I'm glad to say that or to remind that where Estonia is located and how large the country is. So we have a quite turbulent history at the border, eastern border of EU. The story what I'm going to tell you and the results what I'm going to show you is from the past 3 decades. So from 1991 when the transformation process across the country started in all the spheres after 50 years of occupation. It's a small country. It is close to Scandinavia. It sometimes wants to position itself as a Scandinavian country, but it's very important also to say that we are part of EU and NATO as well, which have been kind of a national drive or dream to achieve, and after which was achieved, and before that also it contributed quite a lot to the success story what we have in many fields. So starting point wasn't exactly the bright one, because suddenly in the new day, in the early 1990s, we were left to deal with all the issues we were inheriting from the Soviet period. Difficult economic situation, different economic reforms, quite harsh ones at these days felt by the citizens, which also resulted in the high crime rate, organized crime, also quite a high homicide rate. All the legislation which we had was old practices and the practical experiences, education of people who dealt with the criminal justice issues, the same, quite out of date. We still don't have quite a very long history when we didn't have a death penalty in our legislation. So till 98 we had this in the legislation. Nevertheless, last execution was just at the time of regaining our independence. Prison system was overcrowded, poorly staffed, and also corrupt at that time. No alternative sanctions, or if there were some, they were not implemented according to the Council of Europe's standards of community sanctions and measures, what we know these days. So this was our starting point. But then 3 decades after is the next picture. So what we have achieved, and I'm showing some, let's say, pictures only that what we can measure as a success. There are probably plenty of more, and some other speakers would perhaps emphasize different results. But behind those pictures is 3 decades of work. 3 decades of work across the entire country, starting with legislation, ending with public relations, ending with also investments into the physical infrastructure. Here you see the crimes in total per year, what we have had since 2003. So you see the trend. The trend is important. We have managed through changing the way we address crime. We have managed that the trend line is that the crime level is dropping every year, even these days. It is the behavioral issues are dealt with, but not always through the criminal justice system. And this is very important for our citizens, which I will show you later on as well. For a long time, it has been quite an issue that what has been our imprisonment rate. Of course, here is the comparison according to the United Nations statistical data with the world average. But we, of course, try to compare ourselves with Scandinavia. We are still 3 times higher in that regard with imprisonment rate. But the tendency is that every year we have less people in prison, which is continuous development and which hasn't actually come with a very easy way. It has required several changes in the legislation, in the practices, but also in the mindset, how we position ourselves towards crime, how we perceive as a public also the offenders. There is still quite a great deal to go, but the tendency is such that, for example, the past 2 years, almost 300 prisoners less, and this trend hopefully continues. Particularly happy I'm with this picture because coming from 3 decades back, it was a kind of, we couldn't imagine that kind of thing could happen, that we can manage to keep our juveniles and young people away from the prisons. I remember once in early 2000s, I met at one seminar in Helsinki with Icelandic colleagues, and they told me a story that they are looking for new alternatives for juveniles. They had, I think, one who they needed some different approach to keep him away from the prison. And I didn't even think that we would be in 2022 in the same situation where we look for solutions for a few, not for tens of people. Now we are there, and this is the important shift is that it has been a combination of the social services and the prison and probation efforts which has helped us to reach that way. Of course, the building something is not really a reform, but knowing from where we came, how we came, what did we inherit, and what was the situation, we can now state that our penitentiary system is very new, and our oldest prison dates back to 2002. We already think that perhaps we have a little bit over thought about the dimensions of our penitentiary facilities, but we have a good opportunity to change that in near future as well. But we are happy with this result as well, because this allows us to deal with rehabilitation activities more, not to concentrate on the material issues. Now, looking for the probation, our, let's say, modern start of probation was in 1998. Separate reforms. Every year we have tried to widen the services provided. Parolees, community service, electronic monitoring, treatment of addicts, you name it. We have all different categories of probationers to deal with, which also is a challenge for the methodology. But at the same time, as the crime rate drops, also the number of probationers drops, which of course means also that we have more difficult cases, and we still need to try harder how to make our work successful. Now coming to the public, this is a very, I would say, joyful picture, because here you can see the Eurobarometer survey, and this asks, is crime the main concern for the country from the general public? And as you see, less than 5% of Estonians think that the crime is a kind of a concern for the country. And we came, actually, this doesn't date back this graph for long, but we came from quite turbulent history where the crime was in 90s in top 3 concerns. Now we enjoy the momentum where it's invisible. Only perhaps some high-profile cases are very lively broadcasted and discussed publicly, but in general, it is kind of a sector which is a little bit out of attention, if nothing very eye-catching is not happening at the moment. Of course, this is a trouble as well, because how to proceed with the reforms if something is not always at stake. So this is the new reality, what we have to cope with. But we are glad that we have achieved this situation. Some elements to success in case of Estonia, as you remember from my second slide, Estonia is a relatively compact and small country with a very low population density. So we are able to reform entire country at once. And I think that this is one of the elements of the success as well, because we didn't have perhaps too much time to pilot everything, but we also were small enough to make the pilots across every country. We worked with public perception, we work with all aspects of the criminal justice and also of the country in general. We had total prison reform from staff to buildings. We focused and enlarged in past 20 years the alternatives to imprisonment, started probation service for that also. We are having some successes with the social service integration in terms of juveniles. And it was possible only because we were very eager as a nation to adopt European values, to prove that we belong to the European family. We wanted to have EU membership. We had a great opportunity through that process to learn from best practices. There is still many things to do for us, but it is always a saying which I think is very true. You must have a very good neighbor to learn from. And by good neighbor at this presentation, I mean Sweden and Finland, which kind of sets the base also for the criminal justice reforms for us, I believe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rait. I wonder, before we move to Khary, if I could just ask you a very quick question about this. Obviously, there was a desire that you mentioned to become closer to Western Europe, the European Union, before you were a member. But you said before that there was also a good discussion in the early 1990s, right after you recovered your independence, of what sort of country do you want to be? And it wasn't just, well, we should do that because the Western Europeans say this is a good thing to do. It was actually Estonia addressing, should we be retributive? Should we take over this Soviet system and we are afraid of crime and all this other stuff? Or can we be better than that? Can we treat the system and people with more empathy, with more human dignity? Could you say maybe a short word about the discussion from 30 years ago?
Well, what I can say about this is that in the early 90s, well, I was still kind of ending my secondary school at that time, but there was a very strong independence movement in Estonia. And actually, I think that nobody even thought that we should proceed with the same practices what we had experienced over the last 50 years before that. So this was a kind of national awakening movement, but there was a feeling and also very strong political leadership that we belong to Europe, we belong to the European value system. And that was the drive. We kind of did certain things, I think, more nowadays more smarter, but at these days more in disruptive manner, because we went to the, for example, open market economy like at once with reforms. We didn't proceed with a very slow pace, which also created us many social issues at that time. But nowadays we can enjoy some part of security, but also we have now our own issues, because as the rapid changes we had in 90s caused quite a lot of indifferences. So nowadays, for example, we have regional indifference issues. Also, we have some poverty issues across Estonia because some regions are behind. But nevertheless, on average, I would say that that kind of drive and then that discussion that to abolish everything what was kind of what we experienced after the Second World War was something which actually where people were agreeing as a general society that this is going to go. One way in terms of Estonia decision making is that we have run our reforms really top-down manner, which meant that the political leadership, decision on expert base, and then the reforms. So that was perhaps very characteristic to Estonia as well, which again, the dark side of it is, of course, that you do successful reforms, but some people are going to be left behind. So it's not the kind of, totally that kind of a bright and nice story, because it also has its different impacts. But at that time, I believe for us, it was the only way to go. And the people in general understood that we need those reforms, even if they hurt.
Thank you. Moving on to a quite different scenario, we head over to Khary in Michigan. Khary is sitting in his car for a very good reason, but it relates directly to our work today on empathy and human dignity. But I will let Khary share the circumstances.
So,
Khary.
Yes, can you hear me? All right, I will save the explanation of why I'm in the car for the end. I have almost a quarter of a century in law enforcement. I'm born and raised in the city of Detroit. I'm still currently in law enforcement. Detroit is a city with a population of 640,000 people. In 2018, Detroit was on track to apprehend or incarcerate some 20,000 members from its community. When I was very young, my younger brother was made a ward of the state because he took my mother's car. He wasn't some perpetrator off the street. He was a family member. So in essence, he took my mom's car on a joyride. My mom needed help. And so she asked the state for help. When she asked the state for help, they made him a ward of the state. And he eventually ended up in a juvenile prison with rapists and murderers. I am approximately 6'2", 280 pounds. At 13, he was my size. So although he had the mind of a child, he looked like a man, and he was treated like a man. When he got out of prison, he did not know how to ask for help. And as a young police officer, I did not know or have the tools to offer him to help him navigate what he had been through. My little brother would eventually end up committing suicide after being kicked out of the house. A little while later in my career, I met a 6-year-old boy. And the reason I was meeting him was because his father had been executed by a professional hitman in the city of Detroit. And I had known that young man's family because the year before, the same hitman had killed his uncle. I was standing in his grandmother's kitchen. My sergeant and I were getting ready to leave after consoling the mom or the grandmother. And the 6-year-old came up and he gave me a hug. And I told him that everything would be okay because his grandmother was now taking care of him. 12 years later, I was working at homicide. We had a young man come in. That young man had killed someone during a narcotics deal. He was 18 years old. During the interrogation, he asked me and my sergeant if we remembered him because we were still working together, and we did not. He was the 6-year-old little boy in the kitchen. That young man, before the juvenile lifer law was changed, was sentenced to life in prison. Around the country, law enforcement officials at the end of every calendar year will release the violent crime statistics. And they will talk about the homicide rate, which fluctuates up or down by 10% or 5%. Some cases are extreme. But they will always talk about the number of cases closed. And no matter how much it fluctuates, the number is never zero. The number is never close to zero if it is a large city. And it is always touted as a massive success. I don't think that it is a success or considered a success by the families who've lost loved ones within that year. One of the many things that we continue to see is individuals from marginalized populations, individuals who lack resource, who are born into those situations, are often born into a narrative that doesn't belong to them. And they often suffer circumstances of not being able to tell their story better than someone else can tell their story. If they have access to resources, perhaps they don't make the mistake or commit the crime in the first place. And so law enforcement's response has long been, we need more police. we need more surveillance. And more police does not equal safer streets. Urban areas around the country are proof of that. If you look outside those urban areas to the suburbs, you hardly ever see a police officer unless you need a police officer. For instance, in the suburbs where I live in Michigan, if I call the police will be there in less than a minute. You can be in Detroit and in dire need of help, but because the police are so busy, even if you are being shot at, raped, or murdered, and someone manages to call the police, there are instances where the police have never come. And so it occurs to me and many others that more police is probably not the answer. Policing in Detroit and around the country have begun to evolve, and there is some belief and some buy-in in that. And what a lot of them are doing is they are engaging at-risk youth before or immediately after they've committed initial crimes, immediately after their initial introduction into the criminal justice system. And it shows that that works. In 2016, I set out with a colleague who is from France, but he is a photojournalist that used to work for the Detroit Free Press. And we met when he was embedded at Detroit's homicide unit more than 10 years ago. And he was working on a documentary called Living with Murder. And he was telling the stories of families who had been affected by murder. Either their family housed the perpetrator or their family housed the victim. But both families were affected deeply by the absence of that individual if apprehended or killed. And what he and I understood after striking up a friendship was that we were telling very negative stories of an entire population in a city, and nothing was getting any better. We understood the power of being able to tell your own story. And so we created an organization called Capturing Belief. And Capturing Belief is based on the question, to what degree do images observed in life determine the belief in what is possible? It is a visual literacy and creative writing program, nonprofit, based in Detroit, Michigan. And perhaps the best example of how powerful writing is, if a prosecutor sits down after looking at an investigation that the police have done that lays out what happened in a criminal incident in a community, that prosecutor also gets to weave a story. And oftentimes, if the individual is guilty, that story ensures that they are incarcerated. It ensures that they are convicted, if indeed they are guilty. But there are some times when a story is told about you that is not true. And that untruth may cause you to lose your entire life or several years from your life. And that brings me to why I'm in the parking lot today. I work in the conviction integrity space, and I have been doing so since 2020. My team and I have managed to free 4 people in that 2 years. The first person spent 32 years behind bars for a homicide that he did not commit. The second person spent 16 years behind bars for a triple homicide that he did not commit. The 2 individuals today spent almost 25 years behind bars for a homicide that they did not commit, based on the word of a serial killer who actually committed the homicide. And so the power of being able to tell your own story very well, better than anybody else can tell it for you, will serve you greatly going into the future. But it also combats narratives that are false about an individual or entire groups of people. I think I'll stop there, Charles.
Thank you, Khary. It's always very emotional hearing the stories, but that's exactly the point. Maybe if I ask you just one question, you are a law enforcement officer. You have had the experience that you've had in your life, in professionally and personally, which have intersected in not always the best ways. But you, as you frequently say, you have chosen a way of empathy.
Absolutely.
So how would you reflect that choice for the next police officer over in Detroit? Not every police officer in Detroit is like you, but how do you convince, or how do they come to their own conclusion that that is actually the best way to do police work?
I'm going to try and make this as short as possible in the interest of hearing what our next panelist has to say and giving her the full amount of time that she so deserves. How do I put this? So in the very beginning, before I even thought of law enforcement, I had seen and experienced a lot of trauma, particularly in the 80s. We, my siblings and I, my neighbors and I witnessed a massive change in the community that was extremely diverse to a community that only housed people that looked like us. And the people that looked like us were simply the ones that could not leave if they wanted to. All of a sudden, sidewalks that were laden with chalk where kids were playing hopscotch or hide and go seek became quiet, and you could hear gunshots in some of the most beautiful neighborhoods in the city. Yeah, they were beautiful, but people were still getting killed. When I was 7 years old, I walked in on the first man I ever loved in his attempt to kill the first woman that I ever loved. I was empathetic prior to that. I became cold after that, and extremely detached. Empathy continued to leave at a rapid pace until I got to the police department. By the time I got to the police department, I was in one of the most violent districts that existed in the city, and some would say in the entire nation. And every time I saw people, they were in pain. And every time I saw people that were in pain, they looked like me. I had to shut everything off. If there was a mangled child in front of me whose parent had picked it up by its ankles and bashed his head against a refrigerator and killed it because he was angry because the child was crying too loud and he couldn't hear the football game. No matter what it was, I had to turn everything off. And I think what's really important to understand is that sometimes people will make the statement that a person who comes from a culture can't be racist, or a person that comes from a certain culture cannot be afraid of their own people. And I beg to differ, because the ways in which I was engaging the tribe or community that I came from, all I saw was pain. And sometimes they would try and kill me. And I had to protect myself. And one of the ways that I did that was I retreated from society outside of law enforcement. So the only thing I saw, the only thing I did when I left the house was participate in law enforcement activities. If somebody did a bad thing, I went and I caught them with my partners. And they always looked like me. On very rare occasions, they didn't look like me. But over a span of several years, working with my community in that way, I learned to be afraid of people that look like me. That's based largely on images. And so once I realized that, I had to work very hard to combat the fear of people who look like me, because everybody that looks like me does not mean me harm. Some people that don't look like me mean me harm. And so in order to inform the next generation of law enforcement officer, and I think one thing that I forgot to say was that one of the things that law enforcement is doing right is that they are approaching at-risk populations sooner. But I believe that they should be approached much sooner than the point at which they get in trouble, right? They shouldn't have to be a part of the system to gain resources of somebody just saying, hey, you know, it could be something as simple as saying, this is what my father told me. This is what my mentor told me. A 16-year-old, 15 or 14-year-old would need to hear that. You needed to hear it when you were a child. And so it is the ethos of it takes a village. If I care about you, then I care what happens to you. But if I'm indifferent to you and your circumstance, it's very difficult for me to care, right? It is very easy for me to dismiss what happens to you. But I will say, in the twilight of my career, when empathy came flooding back in, it became extremely difficult to do the job that I was doing because it was so emotional. I want to let, I would love, I want to hear what Marsha has to say. I have another story, but perhaps that can wait. And it speaks to what happened at the very end of my career before I left.
Thank you, Khary.
Yes.
Hard act for Marsha to follow, but Marsha certainly can. And Marsha, I will hand over to you to sort of open this up and bring up the statistics you're seeing nationally and the efforts that you and your organization have made over the last couple of decades to change the course of where things are going.
Thank you, Charles. It's hard for me to follow Khary and not say something in reference to his remarks. And so let me just say a couple of things here. One is that I think it's incredibly important for our listeners today and listeners going forward to understand that the picture, the story, the narrative that Khary has shared about Detroit is not limited to Detroit. That is a story of urban centers across the United States. Please understand that the racism that Khary has also shared about how the justice system and law enforcement historically have functioned is uniform across the United States. Unlike most other countries in the world, we are 51 juvenile justice systems in the United States, 51 criminal justice systems. There is very little that happens at the federal level. The federal adult criminal justice system is substantially larger than the youth justice system, but it is decentralized, administered and managed by not only 51 state entities, but within each of those states, things get broken down even much more so down to the local level. I just think that's incredibly important for folks who don't experience what we do in the US to understand how fractured our system is. The other point that I want to reference to Khary's comments is that I'm a lawyer. And I started Juvenile Law Center with 3 fellow Temple Law graduates back in 1975. And our goal in starting the center was about telling stories, actually. It was about telling the stories of the children whose voices we thought were not heard in the courtroom. And in the early days of Juvenile Law Center, our focus was to be their voice. I want to share that over the course of the more than 4 decades that I have been doing this work, we have evolved the way that we think about our own role in that courtroom, our own role as advocates for children, which is to recognize the importance of their own voices in telling their stories. And we hope that we have gotten better at making sure that their narrative is not filtered so much through our lens and our voices, but that it is heard clearly in the spaces in which we are advocating for them. I also want to be clear that, Charles, you used the word retributive, and the United States is a retributive justice system. One should never doubt that. And I am thrilled, frankly, to be a part of a webinar that is entitled Empathy and Human Dignity. I wish those words were present more in the justice system that I work in. They are, to me, novel ideas on many days of the week when I am doing this work, scarce and hard to find. And what I wanted to talk about today were what are honestly small steps that I think we have taken as a country to come out of a particularly punitive time in the United States. And that was the 90s. And it was interesting to hear Rait talk about the experiences of Estonia becoming an independent country again. And a lot of that focusing on what was going on in the 90s in his own country. The 90s were a really dark space in the United States. For children, it was the era of the super predator myth, which was a notion falsely put out there that largely Black boys were going to terrorize our communities as they came into their teenage years and as we turned the corner into the 21st century. And while that research was discredited by the very person who put it out there fairly quickly after it was put out, even in the mid-90s, it had really profound and devastating consequences for communities of color. And it led to losing a generation, I would argue, particularly again of young men of color in the United States, by exposing them to prosecution as adults, something that the United States does more of than any other country in the world. In the 1990s, we were prosecuting approximately 250,000 children a year as adults. That meant that they were exposed to adult sentences, including the death penalty and life without parole, which you heard Khary reference with respect to one of the young men that he worked with. And if not the death penalty or life without parole, really extraordinarily long terms of incarceration in America's prisons, which are pretty brutal places in many jurisdictions. The way out of that very dark time for us was not a human rights path, which is what I think drives the appetite and the opportunities for reform across most of the globe. In the United States, although we pay lip service to human rights, we don't practice what that embodies. And so it turned out that we needed science and we needed developmental research and neuroscience to really light the way for us and to give us a vocabulary and to give us tools to think differently about children in the United States and children involved in our justice system. And that research led to a series of United States Supreme Court cases that, around the margins, to be clear, banned the most extreme sentencing practices, which remain in the United States for adults, but which we have eradicated for children. And that includes banning the death penalty for children, banning life without parole for children in non-homicide cases, banning mandatory life without parole for children in homicide cases. It is still a sentence that is available that judges may impose as a matter of their discretion on children who are convicted of homicide. And for the most part, children in the US are defined as individuals under the age of 18. That was a big deal in the US. When I am in conversations with colleagues from around the world, I am well aware that nobody else was doing that for the most part, and that the level of retribution and punishment that we practice in this country always exceeds that of what we see in most other parts of the world. The other thing that the science did, and when I say the science, I'm talking about both social science and neuroscience, which simply provided a research base for what everybody actually knows about the differences between children and adults, which is that children, as they are still passing through adolescence and the natural stages of human development, are less blameworthy for the conduct that they commit. They're not thinking when they're making certain kinds of decisions. They are deeply swayed by peer influences, particularly negative peer influences, and they have an extraordinary capacity for change and transformation and rehabilitation. And those qualities in the 21st century finally persuaded our US Supreme Court to think quite differently about how we punish children. The other thing that science has done, again, I think it's somewhat around the edges, is that it also allowed us to look inside our youth correctional facilities and to examine practices there that, again, are largely banned in most other parts of the world. Solitary confinement, the use of chemical and mechanical restraints, the use of strip searches routinely for children who are housed in our juvenile correctional facilities. All of these practices have come under intense and important scrutiny with respect to the importance of realizing that we cannot treat children that way. We shouldn't treat adults that way either, but that we cannot treat children that way. And to some degree, we have been successful in banning those practices, not uniformly, but in pockets and in certain places, we have been able to ban those practices. We have shrunk our system substantially. The level of custody in the US since the 1990s is down 70%. That's an extraordinary drop in the level of custody. It still means, and to my friends and colleagues around the world, take this number and listen to it. It still means we lock up $50,000 to $60,000 kids a day in youth correctional facilities. So think about what those numbers were 20 and 30 years ago for us to have come down by 70%. We've come down dramatically in terms of the numbers of children that we prosecute as adults. That number today, I said it was 250,000 in the 1990s. That number today is somewhere around 60,000. Again, a really significant drop, but a number that is too large for most of us to tolerate if we are thinking about a system that should reflect empathy and human dignity. The last comment that I would make, so that we have time for conversation and questions, is that I think the other thing that the research has allowed us to do in terms of better practices and policies is that in this willingness to re-examine how we treat children, the whole notion of shrinking our youth justice system has been a pervasive theme, I would say, for the last 20 years. And in the process of shrinking, it meant not only closing facilities, not only reducing custody, but it also meant really looking more closely at opportunities for diversion, rethinking how we place kids on probation. We have very high rates of children who are on probation who get reincarcerated across states in the US because they violate the terms of their probation. They violate the terms of their probation because they have 15 conditions that they have to comply with. And it's pretty hard for a child to comply with 15 conditions day after day, month after month, and not get caught doing something wrong. And so again, research has informed our ability to rethink how we utilize probation, recognizing that the fewer the better. Think about what conditions are really essential to help that child get back into their communities and their schools and maintain themselves in productive ways. We don't want them violating, we want them succeeding. And I think the research has played an important role in that. So I think that, you know, I wish that I could tell a different story about empathy and human dignity. I wish that they were the drivers of our system. I think they are tangential to how we think about our system. I am hopeful as I stay in the field, not going anywhere yet. I remain hopeful that that we can get there, and that I often talk about the developmental approach to justice reform in the United States on behalf of kids as being, you know, our substitute for human rights and for empathy. I hope that we can get to a point where the two of those can merge.
Thank you, Marsha. I have a question, if I can dive in. Rait mentioned the importance for Estonia of looking to the neighbors to the west, that is, and north, not the other direction. And also that Estonia obviously is a small country, and so they could enact justice reform for the entire country. The question I have from you is, do you see parts of the United States that are leading the way that could actually have influence on other parts of the United States? So in our discussions in the working groups last year, we heard that in Brazil, in Minas Gerais, over 50 years ago, in fact, a bunch of evangelical Christians thought that there was not enough, based on their own Christian values, felt that there was not enough empathy in the prison system and came up with the open prisons that they employed there. They have reduced the crime rate, they've reduced the recidivism rate, they have reduced the levels of violence, they have increased the ability of the prisoners to reintegrate into society, have jobs while they're in prison, be reskilled, become constructive members. The whole purpose of these prisons is not to lock people away, but to supervise them. Yes, they committed crimes, but to supervise them as they reintegrate constructively into society, and that is better for society as a whole. And yes, their motivations are from their religious beliefs, but they are able to work with allies in other areas, and they've had great success in Minas Gerais, and they have 50 years of data to prove it, not from some foreign country, but from Brazil, which is also a very violent country with a very high prison rate as well. And so the question would be, in Brazil, other parts of Brazil are looking to Minas Gerais as an example of what they might use as a basis for reform. Are there places in the United States, maybe not even the people that you normally hang out with, but are there places in the United States that people are beginning to make these sorts of empathetic reforms based on human dignity, which can lead the way for other parts of the United States? If you don't want to listen to what Rait is doing in Estonia, you can at least listen to what someone is doing in, I don't know what part of the United States. Are there success stories or success stories in the making that can be used to transform the system in the US?
Yes, and that's a great question. We can talk about the positive more explicitly. Yes, California. You know, in the U.S. we often talk about bellwether states. Where do we look for any kind of forward movement, and should that influence what their neighbors or even folks 3,000 miles away should be doing? California has done a lot of innovative things with respect to its justice system and its youth justice system. It has also experienced the same kinds of dramatic shrinkage of its use of custody. It has actually closed its state youth justice agency and is moving toward a more localized approach to youth justice. It has a number of specialized courts that are actually looking at cases of individuals between the ages of 18 and 21, so over our traditional age of 18, to examine their participation and their involvement with the justice system and to explore less punitive, less retributive approaches to their conduct. And there are a number both in Northern and Southern California where they're doing that. Washington State is another example where I think in particular there, the Washington State Supreme Court has issued a number of incredibly progressive decisions that have been transformative for some of the more punitive practices in their youth justice system, and that have really recognized the importance of treating children differently. In New York City, we saw under leadership there a substantial reduction, remarkable reduction in the numbers of children, not only who were incarcerated, but New York kids who were sent upstate hundreds of miles away. And I think what all of this suggests is, again, the decentralized nature of the justice system in the US has negatives and positives. And this is the positive, which is that every state and sometimes every locality, every local jurisdiction becomes an opportunity to experiment. And in addition to that, we have one federal constitution. We also have 50 state constitutions. And state Supreme Courts are free to interpret their constitutions as they believe those provisions were meant to be interpreted. They tend to mirror what our US Constitution says about bans on cruel or unusual punishment and due process, the core components of how we think about our justice system, but states can go farther. And we've seen that with state Supreme Courts or state legislatures really expanding their willingness to be empathic and to think more explicitly about human rights and human dignity in the ways that they govern their own systems. So yes, I think that's a great question. And there are places that we can look to here in the US for influence and inspiration.
To move then a little bit out of the US, right? Obviously, the US Department of Justice has been involved in reforms across Eastern Europe and the former Soviet space since the fall of the Soviet Union 30 years ago. We've certainly heard that the US is good about promoting human rights abroad, if not necessarily at home. But I just wonder how this discussion plays to you as someone who's not an American. So you are from Estonia. You've probably met enough U.S. People in this space. You've worked as a probation officer. You've worked at the sort of at different levels. You were at the Ministry of Social Welfare until you moved back to the Ministry of Justice. So you've had a broad range of experience. I just wonder how this all sounds to you as a non-American, and what you might comment from your own experience.
It's a very tricky question for me, because I'm not finding myself as a big expert of US, but we have had some, I would say, not a competition, but still some contacts. As I have visited several times US, and then also there was, when I was active in Georgia, then there was a support to rebuild and reorganize the criminal justice system of Georgia as well. And there was, of course, there were some projects with the US aid as well. And there, I think that European and US thinking didn't kind of get well along all the time, because the different backgrounds, different systems, different design and thinking was difficult actually to digest that at some points when we are talking about the criminal law, for example. And in that regard, what we don't probably understand too much in Estonia is that how large the country is. And because we are used to that within 2 hours from one point to another, or one border to another. And probably the scale of the change is something which is very visible for us. And looking at the criminal justice, I have to say that the comparison is for us a little bit closer. So as I said, that we look for Scandinavia, we look also for UK to certain, let's say, methods and developments. This is kind of, you know, the points where we are comparing. But I know that in other sectors, for example, about the victim support, how you take in the victim's views, for example, what is the civil society take on the issues, where in our case, the civil society part is rather weak. I would say, then those, let's say, that kind of activities, discussions, this is where we can learn as well, in my opinion, because this is something which we feel that we don't have that strong commitment there in the society as well. As I said, that nobody is concerned about crime. This also kind of triggers that nobody is going to, you know, come and knock at the door to look there. But this year, for example, I'm very happy because we have these prison committees, which are public, which are people from the public, and we had kind of a record in that case that we have a very high attendance at this competition to those boards, and nowadays we have experienced we are experiencing quite a big number of people actually taking or having interest what the penitentiary system is doing. So to summarize, well, for me it is very difficult to really draw the parallels, but I can see the complexity of the system as well. But in Estonia, it kind of, when I'm listening, for example, to Marsha and to other US experts regarding the criminal justice reforms and matters, and also looking at some documentaries and so on, then I think that there are so many differences, but I think the scale is and diversity is something which is very, very different for us. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. So Antonia, I will ask you to release Warren so that he can turn his camera and microphone on. But Warren's been with us in Salzburg twice, in 2014 and 2015. He was there for one of our arts and culture programming, and then he came for one program we did that was also in partnership with Guggenheim on youth economics and violence. But Warren, you have a question. I'd like to let you ask it.
Thank you. Very nice to see you, Charles. Thank you very much to the three prisoners' strong stories. I'm very conscious of my question being placed from South Africa with our history. I believe very strongly that South Africa and America mirror each other in multiple ways. But I was wondering, is there any hope of breaking the stranglehold of the prison industry, and particularly of the racism that is so deeply embedded in the system? And I'm thinking it from the point of view of youth, because if we can find ways in which we can hold youth in a way that breaks those histories of racism, one has some hope for the future. So over to you.
Okay. Sure. So first, I think that most everybody on this call might agree that the answer is in the youth. Well, it occurs to me that if resources are provided to youth in the suburbs here, they flourish. But in places where those resources are not abundant, the youth don't flourish. Provide the youth the resources is a portion of the answer. Teach them how to tell their story to combat narratives that are false is another portion of the answer. But I think that a large portion of the answer to this issue lies in the fact that when I entered into law enforcement, I believed that the more people I arrested, the safer society would become. And that isn't true. Society isn't safer because of the thousands of people that I've arrested. And in some respects, my life and the lives of individuals who look like me are in more danger. And so I always cherished when an older officer who was getting ready to leave, sat down and talked to me and told me what to do and what not to do. But perhaps one of the best pieces of advice I gotten in my entire career, I was in the middle of my career, and my deputy chief pulled me into his office one day, and he said, the majority of individuals that you will deal with on a daily basis don't have anything. The only thing that they have left is their dignity. And if you take it away from them, you give them every reason to fight. In essence, if you're not treating them with empathy, if you're not treating them like human beings, you're always going to have a problem. So I think that the answers or the issue has been worked on by people in the legal field, in policy, but I think law enforcement is lacking in that when we are in the twilight of our careers, we do not turn around and teach the valuable lessons that we have learned. And again, we all agree that the answer is in the youth. So find populations of youth in the country that is affected, that are doing well, and resource the youth that are not doing well the same way, and you'll see a remarkable change. You know, we all want to solve crime, but wouldn't it be better if the crime wasn't committed in the first place, right? So I'll stop there.
I would add a couple of things, and I really appreciate the question. I think that first of all, I want to note to Khary's point about law enforcement isn't the answer. The reforms that I talked about in my remarks, the degree to which confinement in custody dropped by 70% in the last 25 years, crime also went down steadily right up until COVID hit, and that's another conversation that we can have. But right up until 2020, that's just a straight line down. And to those of us certainly in the advocacy space, that's a very telling connection, that even as we reduced the stricter parts of the system, we did not compromise public safety. Crime went down, arrest rates went down, and we need to heed that, and we need to remember that that's exactly what happened in the last 20 years. I think it's also, though, important for us in the US to recognize that in the immediate aftermath of the killing of George Floyd and the summer that followed, there was a sense of optimism. There was a feeling that we were finally at yet another inflection point where we would cross a line and really come back from the edge of what has been, centuries of racism in the US that has really driven the justice system. It's really hard to feel terribly optimistic today in America, where there is heightened, overt racism, kind of seeing it play out as we're having a new Supreme Court justice nominee going through confirmation hearings. And, we know what's lying under the surface there for her as an African-American woman. So there is a sense of I think, sadness that we remain stuck in this place. But to Khary's point, to end on a more positive note, I do feel like it is both in the youth, and I feel like I'm more hopeful about the next generation, who I don't think carry as much in their bones of the sort of racism that is at the core of the US. I have two daughters who are millennials. They're just more tolerant. I think that they are more open and more willing to think about everyone who they encounter in the US differently than I think a lot of us historically have been able to do that. So it's a little bit like check back in 20 years. I don't know, but it is persistent. And I will note that as much as we reduce custody, the racial disparities that were always present for the population that was incarcerated, those same racial disparities persisted.
I mean, one thing we've certainly heard, not only in our working groups last year, but also in the webinars in this series previously, is the exposure to violence and violent situations for children is the single greatest predictor of their encounters with violence as adults. their propensity to be violent as adults, their propensity to be in situations where violence is occurring. And so obviously, Khary has said it explicitly, but we've heard this in the other webinars in the series as well, the importance of a safe neighborhood. The fact that children could play on those streets and then children couldn't play on those streets because it wasn't safe for them to do so. That is important. The 6-year-old that you encountered in his grandmother's kitchen after his father had been murdered, who himself became exposed as a child. He was a 6-year-old. He's an innocent child, exposed to this system. It's very hard to break out of that system, and it's very hard to break out of it emotionally and psychologically. And so I guess the question is for all three of you, maybe Rait, we'll let you start with this one, just to make sure we're not just focusing on the US issues here, but when you transform the system in Estonia, the Soviet system in the prisons was a violent system, if I'm correct, maybe not to the same degree, but how do you break that down? How do you make sure that children are protected from violent settings in a way that will make them less prone to find themselves in those settings in the future? And therefore they are safer, they are happier, they are better adjusted, they are not at risk, where an innocent child in a violent situation is at risk.
Thank you. I was just thinking that first of all, I think that we have now in 3 decades, probably we have made the easy part of the job. So the reforms in that regard that, well, demolished all the old prison facilities, created alternatives, created new, perhaps, prison facilities, if you like, and so on, and then also tried to kind of mix the social services in order to prevent the children to enter to the criminal justice system. Also the diversion, which was sound there as well. We are using quite a lot of diversion measures as well, which are not necessarily implemented by the criminal justice system as such. But now the tricky part is how to proceed, because here it is the question of how much empathy is in the system to the topic today. And I have to say that I think that the key is that how much empathy can be introduced to the system, because the reform process hasn't been always, I would say, the reform process has been quite direct in that sense, and it has kind of caused also a lot of choices in that regard. Regarding children, now it's kind of reflection to the society. The criminal justice, in my opinion, is always the last responder in that sense. Whatever we do in terms of the prevention and so on, we are always too late. And what we see in the society of Estonia nowadays, for example, is that we are talking a lot of family violence. And this is something which has been hidden as well. We have those, let's say, unspoken hidden issues, also dating back to this Soviet period and the inherited problems. And nowadays we are talking more, and we have been, well, the general society is really shocked at how much we have this and how much we have to talk about it. So, but the key in there is, in my opinion, that that the part of the social services or social welfare does its job as well. And we need to kind of somehow more to deal with empowering this part of the work. And probably in Estonian case is that if we could also give some problems in an effective manner back to the communities, because it's not our desire from, I'm a state official in that regard, to take over all the problems what people have. It's rather the other way around. So you need to also start to give back the problems to the society, and then to also empower them to find a solution before the state or the criminal justice or something else kind of steps in. Khary was talking about from the point of view of police, as I understood. Here in Estonia, the police is the most trusted civil service or the public service. So we have kind of, you know, they also work a lot in order to prevent, in order to deal with problems before they become problems. But I think that we here in the Penitentiary Probation Service have to do the same. So the easy part is done because the visible, let's say, parts have been fixed. Now there is also, I think, the next challenge is that what actually Martin has asked as well, how to proceed with the thinking that we can give perhaps more freedom to choose also to the offenders, more problems back to the people to solve, not to over-regulate, not to, let's say, dictate that what is the correct solution and so on. So here we probably one thing what comes in my mind is that we need a kind of united political leadership, because I have experienced that everything starts to go a little bit difficult when there is let's say, that kind of public has some interest towards certain cases, high-profile cases, and when it comes to the political debate about it, it's never about, it's never very emphatic, I would say, sadly. So, in that regard, I think that the political leadership issue is the key, that what we are going to be as a nation, what we are going to be as a country, and can we tolerate really sort of opposition towards that kind of ideas that we will, for example, not use so much the criminal justice system as an answer to certain problems in the society. Of course, we have to do it in a controlled way. In that regard, we have done it so far, but then we still need that kind of leadership.
Did I understand your chart earlier in your presentation that there are only 5 juveniles, so 5 18 and under individuals inside your justice system in the entire country currently?
Yes. But you know, it's the other story is that it is possible only through some new services, new opportunities through the child protection system. And there are some educational services, well, a lot of work, a lot of different kind of services, a lot of attention actually to prevent them to be in our system. But as I said, in early 2000s, we were not thinking about it because there was, I think, 200. The numbers are small, but in our case, the drop is like several times. So we still have to work quite a lot. And if you see that we can actually achieve the situation where we have less people, less youth in entering to the prison, it's extremely hard to get into the prison in Estonia nowadays. So then it kind of encourages us as well that perhaps we can do more. Nowadays we are talking about home imprisonment and such things which would bring us closer to the Scandinavian model that the incarceration rate would be 60 people per 100,000 or something like that. We have 3 times more, 160 at the moment.
I'm looking, we have about 5 minutes left, so I'd like to give Marsha and first, and then Khary a chance to make some final comments. So Marsha.
Well, first, thank you for bringing us together. And I always feel like I learned something from these conversations. I wanted to say something very quickly about your question, Charles, about the exposure to violence. And I know that Khary has talked about this a lot, but one of the things that I'm also now learning, which is relevant for my work, my legal work, is it's not only in some sense kind of the obvious, yes, we would expect that children who are exposed to violence will suffer real emotional repercussions from that. It turns out that there is also new research that individuals, including children and youth who are exposed to violence, that there are actually visible changes in their brain as a consequence of that trauma that they have experienced. And of course, anytime you have changes in the brain, it can also affect conduct. So it is actually more serious and more important to pay attention than we perhaps have previously thought. And I certainly something that I'll be thinking about in my work going forward. I guess the other final comment I would make is that I think a lot of what we've heard, both from Rait and from Khary, is also the importance of getting in earlier, the importance of prevention. I think in the US, we are a reactive system. We respond when someone does something wrong, and we respond with a hammer. Our justice system is a pretty blunt instrument, but we never ask why. And I think that the empathy part gets you to ask why, and the human dignity gets you to care about the why and to try to do something about it. And so I hope that we can move in that direction.
Okay. So to Marsha's point about violence experienced early on, the violence that I experienced early on as a child caused me to be a violent child. And certainly everybody doesn't run towards it. Some people run away from it. Regarding how we could sort of pull ourselves out of this massive hole that we've dug with punitive measures against juveniles, and the way that we look at certain juveniles, depending upon what population they come from. I think one of the biggest and most difficult issues that we're going to have that causes a lot of this is how we are educated in the United States from the very beginning. When we first walk into a classroom, be it preschool or kindergarten, what we are taught, who a hero is versus who a hero is not. It sets us up for the rest of our lives to look at individuals through a certain lens. You know, we suffer the ideals that because I look a certain way, I am superior to everyone. That is embedded in everything that is done here. And it is the root cause of a lot of the problems that exist here. And so that is a much larger conversation. I'm sorry to close on that. I apologize. But I certainly enjoy Salzburg for inviting us to speak to everyone. And thank you to the fellow panelists. This was a beautiful discussion.
Thank you. That is, well, it's not a close in some ways because this initiative goes on. So we hope to address these issues going forward. It's the last of the 5 webinars in this particular series, but the conversation will continue, and we hope to get that out wider. I guess the ultimate question for citizens is, what sort of society do they wish to live in? And what do they expect in their relationship to authority? And if the justice system is not providing safety and security, then what sort of reform is necessary to achieve this? And this is why we find it's important to share these experiences across borders to open up examples of systemic changes that could be adapted in other contexts. So the door remains open. We welcome policy leaders, innovators to get in touch with us and join us as we expand the initiative's reach and impact this year and into the future. And we, in particular, seek public officials who are instrumental positions to implement their reforms and who are seeking ideas that could be adapted for their own jurisdictions. If you'd like to get engaged with us, please let us know. Just let us know through the website. You can get in touch with us on social media as well. If you know officials or social entrepreneurs who might wish to benefit from small, specialist, off-the-record interactions that might help them consider reform opportunities in their own jurisdictions, or who themselves have innovative ideas that they would like to share, please also connect them with us. The recording will be available in a few days, so some of you will be watching this, most of you will be watching this on the recording itself. It will include links to the resources and that have been shared. There's also a few videos that we produced in this series, so those are also linked from the page there, and they feature different videos feature today's panelists. We tried to tell stories with those videos. We've heard from Khary how important storytelling is in all of this, and so we've mixed people up. It's not everybody in the same video, but the idea was to get a story across. I would like to thank our partners, the MacArthur Foundation, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, and the David Rockefeller Fund, our speakers, Rait, Khary, and Marsha, and the team at Salzburg Global Seminar, including Antonia Bemeke, who most of you have been involved with in the background at least, and those of you who posted questions. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing all of you again. Goodbye.